afternoon. Welcome to the live presentation of the After Party with A Better Glenn. I'm here with Shamika Fraser Sorrells, one of our co-founders of A Better Glenn. And we've been spending the past several weeks looking at the 1619 Project as a documentary, and we've been having a watch party at the College of Coastal Georgia and the Stembler Theater. You guys need to come on out this week. We're going to talk about that in a minute. 6 o'clock, Stembler Theater in the Coastal Georgia, Coastal College of Georgia. But we're talking about fear. There's an episode that just came out that we just watched on fear, and it really is an episode, Shamika, that for many of these episodes has really hit close to home. It's almost like she decided just to feature Glenn County over and over again, or the coastal Georgia area over and over again. And you can just see the rich heritage that we have in terms of racial justice and being able to work through racial justice. So I would say, Shamika, that this isn't new for coastal Georgia. I know in 2020, a lot of people were galvanized, but I mean, this has just been a historical reality for us, right?
Yeah, I think it's certainly for folks that are, born and bred in this area, it does affirm this internal fight. It maybe many of us didn't know the source of it, which I think is a beautiful thing that this documentary offers for people that didn't know or need to be reminded that this fight is in us. And so sometimes we may not know what motivates or drives us to do this work, but it's bred, right? It is in our blood for sure.
Yeah. So we're going to get into the episode on fear and some of the things that kind of struck us. But I mean, they started going heavy as soon as the thing jumped off in the beginning. I was like, oh, this is going to be a really tough episode, especially for us in Glenn County, just to be able
Yeah.
to process through. So the episode was on fear, but mostly on police violence against Black and brown folks that has been highlighted over the past several years. But I think she does a really good job of kind of walking through the history of that. And the
Yeah.
documentary does a good job of walking through the history of that, because I don't think a lot of people understand the origins of the police state. And Shamika, one of the things that really struck me about her talking about the origins is just that quote from Thomas Jefferson, when she said that Thomas Jefferson said that justice was on one scale, but they had self-preservation on the other scale. So they're trying to weigh whether or not white European identity wants to self-preserve in our country, as opposed to justice being meted out for Black enslaved people in our country. And ultimately, what they chose was self-preservation through the law, which
Yeah.
is just mind-boggling to me, but crazy. But now we see where it all originated from, the foundation of this country, right?
Yes, self-preservation in terms of, you know, if we were in this situation, we would fight for our freedom as well, right? So, uh, yeah, we got to create all these conditions to keep these people from liberating themselves,
Mm,
which
mm,
is, the part of the fear that she talked to about, right? Like the fear of liberation,
mm-hmm,
um, the fear of
mm,
Black folk liberation specifically.
mm. And that fear really stemmed from what was going on in Haiti,
Oh yeah,
right? With the
yeah.
Haitian Revolution, we see a people group who decided that they were going to rise up and actually confront their oppressors. And
Yeah.
ultimately, they were able to overthrow the government in place and set up an independent Haitian state, which is still there to
Mhm.
this day. And
Mhm.
what the people were seeing across the water in the US was like, wait a second,
Right.
these Black folks rose up in
Right.
Haiti. We got to figure something out over here, because
That's right.
we bought millions of them over here. at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so now we got to figure out how to best keep them in a subservient position so that they don't do the same thing that happened in Haiti. And we see the
Yep.
same thing. We saw it happen in Charleston, even just in
Mm-hmm.
Charleston, South Carolina,
Yeah.
which, there was a slave revolt there. And the folks right up the road in Charleston from Brunswick, Glenn County,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
were like, we can't have this.
Yeah,
We
that's right.
can't have
And,
this.
and didn't travel down the coast towards Jacksonville.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
It did. Yeah. So, I mean, many of them were trying to get to Florida
Mm-hmm.
because Florida had a lot of Catholics and a lot of Black enslaved folks felt like they can get their freedom by being either converting to
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism or claiming their Catholicism that they bought over here from Africa, right? So I think what we saw early on, and here's the thing that struck me the most, was that a lot of the laws that were passed early in this country were geared towards keeping us in our place. Like we think about the law, the legal system in our country, we're like, oh yeah, there's a lot of laws that were passed early in our country, but a lot of them in the form of what they talked about in the documentary, slave codes, were meant to one, prohibit our movement, limit our right to assemble, or even limit our right to own weapons. And I think that one quote that struck me the most, Shamika, was the fact that she said they passed laws to rob us of our joy, that we couldn't even sing or dance legally because that was seen as something that could cause a rebellion, which is crazy to me. What do you think about that? I think you might have froze, but you'll be back. So that's what I was looking at in terms of the slave codes, was that they were really meant um, to really downplay the dignity and significance of African Americans. And I think that those codes came into place for us to be able to not be able to have free movement or free expression for ourselves. So I thought that was really great. If y'all are joining us, we are talking about the fear episode on the 1619 Project. So we've been watching the documentary over the past several weeks. We've been gathering at the Coastal College of Georgia down in Glenn County, just talking about this this documentary and talking about each of the episodes. And this particular episode was on fear, and we've been talking about slave codes and why they were put in place in order to prohibit the movement of slaves in light of the rebellion that was going on in Haiti, and then also in the country, in the US. There were some small slave rebellions that were happening. So they put these slave codes into place, but then you had to ask a question. You really had to ask the question once they put those slave codes in place. And that question was, who was going to enforce the slave codes? Because now you got the laws. Now we got to have somebody to enforce them. And that led to, Shamika, the slave patrols.
And I knew the history of the slave patrols, but what I did not know was that white citizens were penalized if they didn't want to participate, which I thought was like,
that was the Enforced Neighborhood Watch community.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, right. It makes sense because, they recruiting slave patrols or early police officers, that was their recruitment efforts. Was like, hey, if you're white, then you're in. You're part of these slave patrols. And again, yeah, I knew some of that history, but that was really striking. The fact that they had to make sure that the whites who were in the communities participated in these slave patrols.
Yeah.
And man, when they started showing all the white folks calling the police on black people
Right.
in 2020,
Right.
2013, it's like, wow. So it's like ingrained in our culture.
Yeah, I think one of the, and I, my internet, I disconnected for a second, so I'm not sure if you covered this, but one of the pieces that intriguing to me, that connection of laws of the past to with what they call the Karens, right? Was this law that black folks could not have joy. Like it was illegal to have expressions of joy,
Mhm.
which could be playing our drums, anything that said that we were happy and enjoying just being, right?
Mm.
And so it's just it's a, so you had the images of the calls being made lemonade in front of their house, right? Like an expression of joy at a park,
Mm.
having a cookie, like wow, like to police our own innate ability to our God-given right to enjoy this space on earth.
Mm.
That was
Mm. Mm. Yeah, this is the part that was crazy to me. I think they showed a clip of that pastor who was watering his neighbor's flowers, and like the police showed up and wanted to arrest him for trespassing. I'm like, who would break on somebody? Who would go on someone's property and water their flowers? Like,
listen, I'm gonna take your flowers after I water them.
right after I water them, I'm gonna pull them up by the roots just so I could steal your flowers. What is that all about? But
Yeah.
I mean, the cops showed up questioning him, and he's a prominent member in the community. He's a pastor. They knew him. They asked him to do it, but still, this air of suspicion, just because he's African American, really shows up even for people who are well known and respected in
Mm-hmm.
communities. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Tyler
yeah.
position didn't absolve uh black folks often, right? Like that's
Mm,
one of the things that continue to be pervasive. Like it's not enough to be known, it's not enough to position of leadership.
mm,
None of that matters. That the thing that's black, right? And
mhm,
just your blackness creates suspicion.
mm. Yeah. And then I think one of the next pieces that was really visceral and striking was when they talked about the young man in South Chicago, Jamil, who was a
Mm-hmm.
security officer. Um, I think what Nicole said in the documentary was instead of becoming a police officer, Jamil was killed by one.
Yeah.
And here's a young man who
He had.
has this lifelong dream of becoming a police officer. He's doing what he's
Mm-hmm.
hired to do at a nightclub, and he is waiting for the police to show up to kind of help in the process. And he's shot in the back by someone, even though everybody is
Mm-hmm.
yelling out that he's security. Really, really
Mm-hmm.
sad and devastating. But again, it demonstrates that fear because on the other side of it, we heard the narrative that the police officer was fearing for his life.
Yes. Yeah.
Although his back is turned, he's holding down somebody else. The police officer is
Mm-hmm.
in fear of his life from behind him, which I thought was just
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous and crazy.
Yeah. When we had to watch a participant that was a debrief, she made this statement around and this was a white, this notion that police officers and white people in general could just state that they were in fear.
Hmm.
That in that she did not believe that it was a true fear of their lives being hurt, but she said what she believed is that opportunity that they know that they will not be held accountable, and so it is opportunity to exit towards a people that they believe deserve to be. She essentially said that it was a cop out and it's an excuse that police officers in this particular context overutilize. They are in power, and so how could they be in fear? And the question that or the scenario that the most recent school shooting that we had in Uvalde, Texas, and this was a real threat, an active threat that respond to in killing someone. So it was an active threat that was active in fear, and it's not exercised in those spaces, but in the documentary and that we know so well in our own community, it is for people in this particular and more often Black men, right? It's intriguing to challenge the notion of fear.
Yeah. And so, they touched on several of the stories that we know all too well. And unfortunately, many of the names, Trayvon, Tamar, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and obviously Ahmaud, who was part of our community as well. But really touched on this idea of policing in that way, in light of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, right? One of the things that really hit me was, so we had the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. We had the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. But what they mentioned in the documentary was in 1968, this Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act was passed in 1968. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the war on crime didn't start with Ronald Reagan. It actually started with Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So even though he signed into legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, what we saw happening was that there was some civil unrest happening in cities around the country around the time. Harlem, 1964, Watts, 1965, Detroit, and then it culminated in King's assassination, which 120 cities had riots then because folks were just fed up at that point, right? And then they passed this act where millions of dollars went to local law enforcement for riot control and other measures. That's where we see the tanks start coming out, all the other stuff that we've seen show up in the past several years. And so they have militarized the police in a way that really has caused a lot of this to happen over the past 10, 20 years or so. But it all started in the 60s because all we were trying to do was to gain some type of access. And they saw that as a threat and decided to militarize and bring in Vietnam weapons and stuff to be able to do that. What are your thoughts on that whole segment about the legislation being passed for riot control, so to speak?
Yeah, how Hannah kind of stated this in the document was the white fear of Black, right? And so this at every juncture that we attempt to get access, as the words that you use, or what a more recent term, white lash. So I juxtapose that to laws that were passed after a good bit of the thing, and even the anti-protest laws that we now have in legislation. Things happen. After George Floyd, we saw protests happening across the nation, right? And so then we started to see the anti-protest. We saw people voting in droves. Now we see the voter suppression laws coming back in the book. It just keeps being repeated. The inability to assemble
Hmm.
the inability to assist ourselves together to, protest, even peacefully. Um,
Hmm.
uh,
That's
our
right.
someone put in the chat. I
About
think I want to
the,
say Liela. I'm not sure. Laila, what's your name? The 1968 Kerner Commission report and what happened around it is an interesting read.
yeah, the
Are you
Kerner
familiar?
report. Yeah, the Kerner report was put out in 1968, in actually in light of what's been happening around the country. What I talked about with the riots, well, with the civil unrest, because they like to call them riots. But that report was one that Johnson put together to identify what the origins of the violence, and it really is a intriguing read and report that actually led to the omnibus crime and bill act and bill. So they tried to go through and conduct some studies around it, but I think it was to justify what they were actually going to do. But that's certainly something that I would commend people to look at, even if it's just a summary of it. It certainly is something that is worthwhile and worth reading. One of the things that I really want to make sure we highlight here, because again, as Susan says, it's a cycle. It really is a cycle, right? Because what you're going to see is that over the course of our country's history is resistance is always followed by legislation.
That's right.
That in the cycles of resistance that we've seen in our country, there's always legislative effort to suppress the resistant efforts in order to get what is basic equality, human rights, things that would seem basic from a human perspective, but it keeps those in power who are in power. So we've seen this over the past several years. Like even now, like we're not paying as much attention to our legislatures as we should, because there's so many legislative efforts being made in order to suppress us in areas of education,
Yes.
voting, and other things that will not just impact us as adults, but also our children. And if we sit back and do nothing about it until the next fire comes up, by that time, all of our rights will be stripped away from us. So how do we go about continued resistance in light of legislative efforts that most people won't be aware of? A lot of people won't be aware of because they may not know how to go about looking into it.
One of the things that I think we also should be caught this backlash and these legislative reactions of fear that is created to make the public believe that the put in place is necessary. Right. So when we think about the legislation that's been in Georgia around, or that's attempting to be passed here in Georgia, school education and funding private school, that on its surface, like a great idea to some people, right? Like, oh my God, private schools, maybe smaller classrooms, all the things that may get my child access a curriculum that will give them access to better schools. So yeah, that sounds great. But the reality of it is there has been so much fear created around and part of that fear has been driven by the lack of that is provided to public schools. And so essentially then you will impacted the most are the folks that are dependent on a public school education that is already right. And so this amount the narratives that are created that fuels fear, I think is something that we have to challenge. So let's connect this back to Ahmaud Arbery and locally, the suggestion that he broke into which justified his killing was already been sold over centuries since we've been in this country about this fear of narrative that Black people are criminals. And so we have to start to challenge the narratives, Black people specifically, since that's what we're talking about, but we have to challenge those narratives, fear that then allow for legislation to be passed.
Yeah, and I think that really ties into what the documentary started on, which was this idea of slave patrols, because absent that legal principle, you wouldn't have a citizen's arrest law in place that someone could potentially lean on when those citizen's arrest laws are essentially what stem from the slave patrol, right? So what we see is the legislature, after something tragic happens, then decides that the citizen's arrest law is no longer something that we need to adhere to as a community, but now we've lost one of our sons in the community, right? Now we've lost someone. So why does it take that in order for these antiquated laws that are really based on racial principles really are overturned? You know, there's a difference between legal principles, and this is a law school term, so apologize for saying it, but de jure versus de facto. So de facto is how the law actually impacts people every day. De jure is what's on paper. So what's on paper doesn't necessarily have racial undertones, right? But then how it plays out becomes the de facto racial issue that really plays out. You see it in housing, you see it in our education system. So even though these laws look unracially motivated on paper, what happens is once they stamp them and once the governor approves them, the implications of the local communities being able to operate under those legal principles makes them, as a matter of fact, racially motivated. And so I think we have to look underneath the language in the law in order to best see how it impacts the local communities. And people aren't seeing that or aren't saying that. Say, well, if I read it, it doesn't look like it should be something that impacts Black people negatively. Well, let's look at the data. Let's look at the statistics. Well, let's look at what happens as a result of that law being put into place. And once you do that, you learn and understand that as someone who wants to change the systems, you really have to go beyond what's on the paper and put your boots on the ground and see what's happening in the community so that you can understand how those laws impact the local people and the local communities.
Yeah, and I think, which is one of the reasons why we exist as an organization, is to educate, right, and to give people access to information that informs them to do and to think differently first, and then once you think differently, to do differently. And one of the pieces that I want to mention about the citizens arrest law, like that was a significant win, but it's not all that has to be done, right? So we could just say, oh, that's great, like, citizens arrest law is gone now. The crime was, and I'm speaking particularly to Georgia and Ahmaud Arbery's situation. Citizens arrest law is removed. The crime was deemed a hate crime, and so yes, now we know that it was racially motivated, and that's success. And we could just stop there. And it would be ignorant to believe that there aren't other laws or there aren't other ways that's going to be implicated that will still impact Black folks, as you said, particularly Black boys. So the narrative now that exists in the community is that Brunswick, Georgia has a gang problem. We need to be tough on crime. Every article that you see in the newspaper often has a Black male's image on it associated with crime. So if we believe that we got vindication and that there aren't other Black men in this community subject to the same fate
Mm.
of Ahmaud Arbery that might be in the hands of a police officer as opposed to a private citizen, then we are mistaken because everything that is here still suggests that black men should be feared,
Mm.
that
See, that's
black men
the,
are the crime.
and I think that's the problem. I think too many people are satisfied with the low hanging fruit. But I do believe that there are some folks who have a palate for and a hunger for justice that goes beyond the low hanging fruit. Because now
Oh, for
folks will give you like, hey, we'll give you this low hanging fruit, and now y'all go back to your lives as usual. And we're like, man, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like if you go underneath the water, there's a whole big iceberg underneath that we have to get under there and chop that thing up piece by piece so that future generations can navigate these choppy waters that we have seen, not just in Glenn County, but across this nation. So I think, as a community, we have to not be satisfied with getting that low hanging fruit, which I think some people are. And then there's other people who are like, hey, there's no urgency. We can get to this gradually, right? There's a process to this. And for us, we're like, man, this is urgent and important, and we got to be able to work on that. I did want to mention one thing that Nicole said in the documentary. She said, fear of Black liberation has long motivated state and federal authorities to surveil and sabotage Black leaders and Black-led organizations attempting to disrupt the existing social order. And in essence, what's that saying is that, man, those in power are always going to be able to try to sabotage those attempting to point out the flaws in the structure in the system. And here's the thing that really got to me. She said they will often have people infiltrate those organizations as informants. I said, "Oh my goodness!" Oh, we saw that with the Spies of Mississippi. If you have not seen that documentary, I suggest that you would watch that. But there was a Black-led organization in Mississippi by which local authorities paid Black informants to go in and infiltrate the organization so that they can arrest those who were trying to get basic rights, as in voting rights. So as a Black-led organization, Shamika, that really resonated with me because, we definitely have run into issues of those in power not really liking what it is that we're doing, but it really also serves as fuel to motivate me and us to continue to go, because I think the people are too important for us not to be able to continue to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that proves that power lies in the people, right? And so I believe the folks that want different, there's more folks that want different than there are more that want things to remain the same. And so that attempt to disrupt that proves that that folks know that ultimately when people decide that they want to do different and come together and do different, that they know that it will dismantle these systems that, quite frankly, only work for very few. So
Yes.
that's the other piece, that the majority of people are not benefiting from these systems that are only supporting a few people. The majority are not benefiting. And I think that's the other challenge, is that folks have to understand that when you are lifting up those that are most marginalized in any situation, whether that be a difference by race, whether that be a difference by gender, sexual identity, those that are most marginalized, when you begin to center that into the conversation, center that into the solutions, everyone benefits, because the same rules that are put in place to keep certain groups from access ultimately provide a pathway to keep most people from access. And I think that's our our challenge and our opportunity.
Wow. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So Wendy said she is proud of you and your organization is making Glenn better.
Thank
I
you.
definitely agree. Have to agree with that. And grateful for those of who have come alongside us as allies, partners, whatever that may be, to be able to to do the work. It really is difficult, but I think this episode really hit home for me in many ways because, Shamika, I don't think we were doing our professional lives thing in 2020, and here's the thing: you hear about these incidents happening in other communities, and you support in ways that you can. But there's something different about it happening at home
Mm-hmm.
that I always talk with people about. Being that it happened in Brunswick, Georgia, where we both were born, and being able to see that happen in your backyard, it hits different, and it also gives you a different type of passion for it, because here we are 3 years later, you know, many of the news outlets have moved on. Even many of the people who've done some stuff locally have moved on. National activists and all those folks have moved on, right? But there's day-to-day stuff that continues to need to happen locally that we are continuing to do because it's home. And I always tell people, like, activism, whatever that may be, whatever you want to call it, I'll call it advocacy, works best with the local people,
That's right.
because the national voices are going to continue to move from tragedy to tragedy, but there's something about local people being home, it being home, that entrenches them, puts them in the trenches. And I'm just grateful and thankful for everybody in Glenn County
Mm-hmm.
for partnering with us to continue to do the work, even long after all the cameras and stuff have gone. Like, there's work that needs to continue to be done, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has encouraged me most about our community is um, it did create a pathway for people to be in conversation that I don't know would have been in conversation without it happening. Um,
Mm,
and it's uh, not to suggest that anyone should be a martyr to the movement, because God, if Ahmad could still be here,
yeah.
and not exist, that's what I would pray for.
Mm,
Um, but I think it's a personal commitment that we have made. And I didn't know him personally. Let me just say that
right.
I didn't know him personally. Um,
Right.
but it no less made me um, committed, because what I do know is that when conditions are different in a community, the outcomes are different. And so
Mm,
what we don't want is our successes, that no one has to that our community, children in our community, and young people and adults in our community have access to opportunities and experience positive outcomes, and that their lack of access or lack of outcomes or negative outcomes isn't determined by them living in Brunswick, Georgia. And
mm,
unfortunately, right now it is. The outcome
mhm.
success is directly, or lack of success is directly connected to living here in Brunswick, Georgia. What we're hoping to change. But the
Yeah.
conversations and people that have been attending the watch parties have said this overwhelmingly, that they want to have a space to continue to have conversations, not just about the issues that impact Black folk and people that are in poverty, but just what are the conversations that we can have that make us understand that we are more alike than we are different,
That's
and we
right.
start to see each other as humans, um, and not these narratives that are um, posted across the web or posted across the newspapers, all of
Mm,
these negative narratives. What would make one not fear? I heard this new term over the past weekend, and I'm probably going to mess it up, but it was this idea of the causeway fear. Like, folks don't
mm.
want to cross the bridge from St. Simon's Island to come to Brunswick,
Wow.
Georgia, because
Wow.
they are fearful of Brunswick, and that
Mm,
and what they're fearful of is Black people. Let's just be really clear and name that
mm,
that
mm,
60% of Brunswick, Georgia, 60% of the city is Black people, and there is a
mm.
fear to come across the bridge. 15 minutes. There's a fear,
Wow.
because there is a perception that it is unsafe here.
Mm,
And I thought that
mm.
was interesting, because I was like, I think if you would ask most Black folks here, they probably feel unsafe for very different
Right.
reasons, right? But there's an
Yeah.
idea that it is unsafe. So we're trying to bridge these divides, like a literal bridge.
But
Like we
literally,
really need.
like emotionally, all that. There's something that needs to be bridged there, and I think that these conversations that you're talking about, they have to be three things. They got to be awkward,
Mm-hmm.
they got to be uncomfortable, and they got to be transformative. We cannot have monologues telling people why they're wrong, right?
Yeah.
We cannot have monologues telling people we know all the right answers and we're empowered. You need to listen to us. Like those conversations actually need to be truthful and also get at the root of the matter and actually lead to something. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not interested in talking just for the sake of talking. Like there need to be some outcomes from it, which is why, for these watch parties, we do have some next steps that we're going to take people through. And we want people to come out on Sunday to kind of hear about some of that. But listen, we're not just trying to show up and watch a documentary and have conversations, which were great and robust conversations. But our team is always asking, okay, so what? What's next? Because what's next is what's going to lead to the change. The conversations have been happening for years in various ways, but at some point you got to tired of talking and start working and doing the work, and that's what
Yeah.
we plan on doing.
Yeah. I wonder, like, I've often thought, what would I want people to know about our area if I was to go somewhere and they say, where are you from? Unfortunately
Mm,
now they're like, wait a minute, I know that place. What do I know that place from?
yeah,
And a mod
yeah.
comes up. But what would I want people to know about this area? And what I would want people to know is that there are warriors here. Like,
Mm, mm,
as you talked about earlier, and as the documentary has shown, like, this is the seat of resistance. There is some fighting people here,
yeah,
and
yeah.
which we are both born from, right? So I would
Mm,
want people to know that, and I would want people to know that it won't be the same when we're done with it.
mm. Man, from Igbo to Sapelo, we got some
I love
fighting people.
from
You hear
Igbo
me?
Sapelo.
Sheesh.
Next
We got
T.
some fighting people. Next t-shirt.
Absolutely. Now, John, I know that you probably try not to give folks a teaser, but I do
Mhm.
think that for some people that might not have been able to be with us in person over these last few weeks and may not be able to be there on Sunday, I do want
Mhm.
to let people know some of the things that we are going to be doing next, and
Mhm.
just in case. So can you talk
Yeah.
about the justice journey real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of years ago, we kind of came up with this idea of empowering young people in our community and came up with this idea of this justice journey that we wanted to take kids on. So last year, we took them to Sapelo, we took them to Savannah, and we took them to Charleston to kind of immerse them in Black history and this culture of resistance that we're talking about, right? And so this year, our plan is for phase two of it, we're going to be taking them on a journey through the South. So we're going to take them to 5 cities where social activism was really active in the 60s. We're going to Atlanta. We're going to Montgomery. There's a brand new museum there in Montgomery that we're going to take them to. Obviously, that's where the bus boycott happened as well. We're going to go to Memphis, Tennessee, go to the Lorraine Motel, Little Rock, Arkansas, to see Central High School, and then come back through Birmingham, Alabama, to go to 16th Street Baptist Church, which is where we lost 4 precious souls who were worshiping on a Sunday morning. We really believe it's going to be a transformative journey for this group of students across Glenn County. They're high schoolers, and our team has been talking with some of them about some of this stuff, but we want them to be able to see it hands-on. So this Sunday, we're going to talk a little bit more about it, but if you're listening, if you're on here, we want to certainly invite you to partner with us on that. And you ask how you can do that. You can give to our efforts. Go over to our website at abetterglen.org, click on that give tab, and there's also a drop down for the justice journey that you can give to those efforts. And then we're also going to have you partner with us in terms of, as we ramp up for the justice journey, through reading some of the books that we've been giving away through our free library. We're going to talk about that Sunday at Stembler Theater, but we want to continue this conversation through a book club. We've given away over 100 or so books to folks locally in our community. Now we want to start working through those and talk about how we can implement some of the best practices that we see in some of them, or just think through what's happening in those books in a collective community manner. So if you want to be part of that book club, if you want to help us through the justice journey, show up Sunday so you can hear more about it, but also you can go to our website and give through those efforts, and then also fill out our contact form. So appreciate you for bringing that up, Shamika. I think it's important for people to know.
Yeah, and one more thing we have that's in March. It's not us, but we're one of the sponsors of an organization called Via Collective that's putting on a women's conference that's happening on March the 25th, and it is the first of its kind here in Glenn County, where we're bringing women from all backgrounds, diversity, experience, to really talk about how we empower each other and build our community. And one of our team members, Laura Carana, and I will be facilitating a workshop session around building a community that thrives and centers equity. So if you are interested in attending, we are still giving away some free tickets. Head over to our Instagram page, Better Glen, and like the posts that we have there about the event, and we'll announce those winners next week. So we're giving away 6 free tickets. So please look at that. And the other thing that I will add, in terms of like the episode and going back to the episode and what we talked about, is really the antidote to fear is being courageous, right? So you think about anything that you're scared of. Folks will often say, do it. If you're scared of a roller coaster, maybe find a Ferris wheel and get on first. Go around the Ferris wheel. Then you may go to another, you may move that up a step and go to a roller coaster that's not quite as high. And then you ultimately get to that highest roller coaster. And so what we mean by that and being courageous is that you just enter into the conversations, right? Like as John said, we don't know it all. No one does. We're just entering into these spaces. And so we're just asking people to be courageous with us. That's how we ultimately make change here, is to start the conversations, to start your path to being educated on various issues. So that just be courageous with us.
No, that's great. I like that. I like that idea. We need to have those courageous conversations for sure. So appreciate you for bringing that up. And Sunday, 6:00, Stembler Theater. This is our culminating session. So make sure, if you have not made it, you want to come to this one because they've been amazing so far. This week is on justice, the idea of justice. We're going to have a group of students joining us, and then our team is going to come and kind of make that culminating conversation happen. But if you have time, Stembler Theater at the college, right there off of Altama, Stembler Theater will be there at 6:00 sharp.
Yes.
Appreciate you guys Anything else, Shamika? Did I miss anything?
Nope, I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank y'all for coming to the after party. Hopefully it was lit for you. And we say lit anymore or no?
I
Oh
don't know.
boy.
It's Friday. We all
All right. We'll see y'all later.